it really is bizarre. I mean, often, there's that great graph of showing the obesity, levels in the US over time. And it sort of is pretty flat until about 1980. And then it sort of takes off, from 1980 onwards. And it's been steadily increasing ever since. And, I often sort of think, if someone was running a business and their bottom line was getting worse every single year for 40 years, wouldn't you at some stage in that 40 years think, maybe we're doing something wrong, or maybe we could change something? But no, we just keep giving the same advice and people keep getting fatter and sicker.
Peter, thank you. Dr. Brukner, appreciate
Shawn.
it.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
My apologies. I usually just at 9 o'clock in the morning. I'd mentioned this morning doing it at 3 my time. I was actually doing a rowing workout. I was like, oh crap! So I'm a little out of breath. I just hopped off the rowing machine. But anyway, thank you very much for a long time. I know you've been in the low carb space for quite a long time. I know at least as long as I've been at it, you've been doing it probably even longer. For those that aren't familiar with you, obviously you're in Australia, but can you tell us a little bit about who you are, if you don't mind?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm in Melbourne, Australia, and I'm a doctor, and I'm a specialist sport and exercise medicine physician. And I've basically spent my whole life pretty much in sports medicine. So running a clinic here in Melbourne, but also working with a lot of elite athletes and elite teams. I've worked with various professional sort of football teams and national sporting teams, national sort of swimming, field hockey, athletics. I was with the athletics, track and field team for 10 years. I went with them to the Atlanta Olympic Games in '96 and the Sydney Olympic Games in 2000. And then I looked after our national soccer team for 4 years leading up to the World Cup in 2010 in South Africa. And then I went straight from there to a stint at the Liverpool Football Club in the English Premier League. I was their head of sports medicine, sports science, a few years there. And then came back and looked after our national cricket team in Australia, which is probably our sort of number one profile team. Strange sport, cricket, but us members of British Empire love it. And so I did that for 5 years, and then since then I've just been I guess about 10 years ago now, I got interested in the nutrition side of things. I'd always been a little bit interested in sports nutrition as it related to performance and so on. In fact, I think I wrote a book with a dietitian on that 30 years ago on sports nutrition. And but sports nutrition had got a bit boring, really. It was all about carbs and carb loading and pasta parties the night before the marathon, and Gatorade and Powerade, and that was all it was about for 20 or 30 years. And so I wasn't that interested. But about 10 years ago, I was living in Liverpool in England, and if you'd asked me then, was I healthy? Was I well? I'd have said, yeah, I'm good. I just turned 60. I'd been on a supposedly healthy diet, low fat sort of diet all my life, and exercise regularly. The reality was that I wasn't probably quite as healthy as I thought I was. For a start, I had a family history of type 2 diabetes. My father had developed type 2 diabetes at exactly the age I was then, and I was pretty keen not to go down that track. I'd seen what it did to him, and it wasn't pretty. And I was determined not to go down that track. But I thought I was doing all the right things. I was obese, overweight, obese. My BMI was about 30. Like many middle-aged men, and I regard 60 as middle-aged. I used to think it was old, but now I think it's middle-aged. That I'd probably put on a pound a year for 30 years. And I was probably 30, 35 pounds overweight. And my kids are starting to sort of poke me in the in the belly and say, come on, Dad, and I'd shrug my shoulders and say, well, I'm doing all the right things. I'm on the right diet. I'm exercising. It's not fair. And I'd also had a condition called fatty liver for 10 years. I had my regular blood tests, and everyone came up with fatty liver, and as a typical doctor, I'd ignored it and I guess I didn't really understand what fatty liver was, and I figured I was on a low-fat diet, so it must be the right thing to do. And I had high triglycerides, high insulin levels, so I was metabolically clearly. In retrospect, I can see I was metabolically unwell and pre-diabetic. Really, I have no doubt that had I continued along the same vein, I'd be well and truly type 2 diabetic by now. So around that time, I have an old friend called Tim Noakes, who you no doubt know, Shawn. And I've known Tim for many years. We're crossed paths in the sports medicine, sports science world for a long time. And we're often sort of the two token non-Americans at sports medicine conferences. And, we'd sit in a corner and talk about rugby and cricket and, the things that you North Americans didn't understand. And so Tim was an old friend, and Tim's a super smart guy. And I'd always admired his intellect, and he'd challenged certain theories in sports medicine over the years, and invariably been proven right. And when he sort of came out in around 2012 and started saying that admitting he'd been wrong about carbs and had changed his own diet from a high carb to a low carb diet and completely changed his whole turned his health around. I sort of thought at the time, Tim's finally lost it. He's this is just one step too far, Tim. We couldn't possibly have got this sort of wrong, for 30 or 40 years. The whole of every Western country in the world was on this sort of diet. And here's, one guy saying, we were wrong. And I know he wasn't the first, but he was certainly the first that I'd come across. And but I thought I had enough respect for Tim's, intellect, I guess, to start looking into it. So first thing I did was buy Gary Tauber's book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, and that book just blew me away. I mean, I just couldn't believe what I was reading. It was not only about the relative merits of fats and carbs, but more about the politics and the history of how sort of the low fat movement won out over the low sugar movement, which I'd always assumed was due to good science and evidence and so on, and turns out to be due to money and politics and ego and various other things. So, and I found the book really disturbing. I mean, I remember putting it down at night and sitting on my bed thinking, no, this couldn't be right. Like, we couldn't have got this so completely wrong. Anyway, I'm a bit OCD, so I dived into this as deep as I could. I read every book I could. I read I think around then Nina Teichelt's book came out, and a whole lot of other books. Every research paper, every research article, and the more I read, the more I was convinced that this is we might have been wrong. We might actually have got this wrong for 30 or 40 years. Now, as a doctor, we pretend to be scientists, Shawn, don't we? So I decided it was time for a bit of research. But also as scientists, we know that research with an n equals 1 is a waste of time, except when the 1 is you, in which case, an n equal 1 experiments becomes very important. So I decided it was time to do an n equals 1 experiment on myself. And I decided I'd do a low carb diet for 3 months and see what happened. So on day 1, I weighed myself, I got all my bloods done, and I embarked on this low carb diet. So basically stopped eating all sugar, starches, no rice, pasta, potatoes, bread, all that sort of stuff, and went back to eating, real food, really the way that probably my parents and grandparents had eaten, meat and fish and non-starchy vegetables. Went back to eating eggs, all that horrible cholesterol we've been told about for all that time, and full-fat cream and dairy and so on, and nuts and seeds. The only fruit I had was berries, and away I went. And to cut a long story short, because I'm waffling on here, but to cut a long story short, at the end of 3 months, I'd lost 13 kilograms. So what's that, about 28 pounds in 3 months. And I'd reversed all my metabolic abnormalities. My liver function returned to normal, first time in 10 years. My triglycerides came down to normal. My insulin normalized. My exercise capacity increased. My sleep improved. I felt fantastic. That was it. That was the most amazing. There was just one drawback. I had to get a new wardrobe because I'd gone down 2 sizes in everything. But I figured that was a small price to pay, Shawn. So I guess that's, that in a nutshell was the sort of turning point for me. And as when you have an experience like that yourself, you've got one of two choices. You can either say, well, I'm all right, mate. I'm good, and I'll just worry about myself. But I really felt I had to share this with people and tell people about it. Initially, just family and friends, and well, people noticed it for a start. People kept asking me, well, what's happened? And so I started to become an advocate, I guess, for low carb and so on. And I guess the last 10 years has been on that journey of trying to promote a low carb diet. I've set up a charity called SugarByHalf, where we try and campaign to reduce sugar intake by half, because the average certainly Australian and probably North American has 15 to 20 teaspoons of added sugar a day in their diet, and the World Health Organization admits that less than 6 is probably ideal. So math was never my strong point, but that's about half, and so we're going to try and reduce that by half. And so we run campaigns, and we got school lessons and things like that. And then a few years ago, I wrote a book. We all like to write books, Shawn, don't we? So I got approached to write a book, and to be honest, my initial response was, the last thing the world needs is another diet book, because there's a hell of a lot of them out there. But they convinced me that there weren't many biomedical people, and certainly not in Australia anyway. So I wrote a book called The Fat Lot of Good, and that's been very, very successful. And then 12 months ago, we decided we'd tackle the type 2 diabetes issue, and we launched a campaign called Defeat Diabetes, which is an app-based program with my colleague Paul Mason in Sydney. And we've developed a whole lot of video content and articles and recipes and meal plans and all that sort of stuff. And that's going pretty well. We're getting a lot of interest in that and getting some really exciting results. So that was a long intro, but that's basically my life, Shawn. So here I am.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a couple comments, if you don't mind. First of all, the fatty liver thing, I guess perhaps we should go to France and teach the guys that are making foie gras how to make it properly, and tell them to stop feeding all the grains to those geese, right?
Yeah, exactly. We don't learn, do we? It's amazing.
Yeah, exactly. And the points you make about the politicization of science. We've seen that. I think people are becoming acutely aware of that, but it really is who has the most money, who's paying for the studies, and what's the outcomes they want to direct. The point about clinically relevant studies, there's a lot of studies out there, and you can say, well, is it statistically significant? And if it's statistically significant, is it even clinically relevant? And then it becomes, is it clinically relevant for who? Is it? And the N equals 1 is very clinically relevant to me. I mean, that's the point. It's like, do your own work, and you can look in the mirror and decide what if it's confusing, because it clearly is. Admittedly, there's so much contradictory evidence out there. I just say, look in the mirror. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. The thing about the sports medicine stuff, I find, I'm still masquerading as an athlete into my advanced years. I'm still trying to do stuff, so I'm still interested in my performance. And I mean, just to touch on that, because I think the diabetes and the health side is such an important part, and that's mostly what I'm interested in. But I still have a part of me that likes to talk about athletics.
Yeah, and yes, I'm the same, actually. I'm exactly the same. I know you can't escape it.
When I was listening to your story about discovering, I don't want to get type 2 diabetes late in life. Tim Noakes has the exact same story. My story is very similar. I was in my mid 40s, and I'm getting fat, and I'm getting hypertension. I know I've got metabolic syndrome. I'm an athlete. I'm a doctor. I shouldn't have this happen to me. And I had to wake up about nutrition. So very fortunately, rather than finding out at 60, I found out at 42, which gives me, maybe a little bit more advantage. Let me ask you, we talked about carb loading, and that's, I guess that these Scandinavian scientists from the 1960s started pushing this, and then Gatorade started making a lot of money at it. Has the thinking much changed? I know you got, was it Louise Burke's down in Australia, who's a big advocate of, the same sort of stuff. Do you think that's is it somewhat contentious now, as far as you're concerned about the sports performance?
Yeah, absolutely. It's changing. Even Louise Burke is starting to sort of to mellow. Louise is the best known dietitian probably in the world, really, and she's been a massive carb fan, and even she's sort of admitting that there is a role for reduced carb and increased fat. She's promoting this sort of train low, compete high concept, this hybrid concept of basically keeping low carb on your sort of relatively quiet days, but if you have a heavy training day or a competition, you might need some extra carbs and so on, which I think for a lot of people seems to work. But yeah, it is slowly changing. There's still a lot of people who are pushing the carbs. And I have a couple of problems with that. One is that we have a whole generation, and you're probably part of this generation, Shawn, of athletes who've consumed massive amounts of carbohydrates, during their competition years, and often in simple form, in drinks and gels and so on. And I have real concerns about, the long-term issues that they have, and the problems with insulin resistance and so on, and potential, cardiovascular issues and so on. So I have that issue, but obviously performance is the key. And when you're an athlete, you're going to do anything you can to get performance right. And so it's certainly, there's reasonable evidence now that both in the ultra endurance, there's probably advantages to a low carb, sort of a higher fat diet, and even in endurance, and even for some power athletes, you've got to increase your power to weight ratio and all those sort of issues. So what I do find with my athletes is that there's a lot of individual variation. I have elite athletes who are strictly low carb, even ketogenic, who do very well. There are others who say no, who try it and say, no, look, I just felt, I felt great, but when I needed that extra surge, or that, extra had to, a cyclist who had to climb or a sprint or whatever, I just didn't have that extra. So they need to top up on carbs. So it's a little bit of horses for courses. You've got to experiment a little bit on what's right for each individual. I think there's a right amount of carbs for everyone, and that's related to a whole lot of issues, your degree of insulin resistance, et cetera, et cetera. So it is changing more slowly than it should change, probably. There's obviously, there are a lot of people, and the same in the general sort of non-sporting world. There are a lot of doctors, dietitians, and so on who've built their whole career around promoting low fat as the diet of choice. And it's not easy to suddenly, turn around and say, I was wrong. So that's really difficult, and that's why it's taking such a long time, I think. But in the performance world, we're definitely not as obsessed about carbs as we used to be, I think, and it's much more balanced than it used to be. But we've still got a way to go.
Peter, I have no idea who these people are, what it refers to. I'm hoping you do. This is from Lark, who's a fellow Victorian down there that is
Right.
from Australia. She's asking about your theory about Shane Warne and Rod Marsh. I don't know who they are. Maybe you can
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, Shane Warne is probably the greatest cricketer one of the greatest cricketers of all time, and Rod Marsh also incredibly famous cricketer. And very sadly, last week they both died of heart attacks. And Shane Warne was 52, Rod's 74. So I guess he's allowed to die. But still both seemingly healthy, and it's really focused a lot of attention on heart disease, and we had a politician in Australia who died at the same age, 52, last week, and an AFL footballer who had a cardiac arrest at 52. So it seems like 52 is a very bad. How old are you, Shawn? 52 is a bad age.
I'm 55, so I made it.
Oh, you're okay. Relax. Okay. So yeah, what that's done is really focus attention on the problem of heart disease in sort of younger people, and there's been a lot of talk. Shane Warne, for instance, he was a smoker, and despite being a very elite athlete, he was a smoker and had a poor diet, and so people are suggesting they may have been factors. There's been a lot of discussion about COVID and its effect on the heart, and the vaccine and potential effect on the heart. So there's a whole lot of issues out there that these deaths have sort of brought to the surface, and we obviously don't have any answers, and we don't know what the causes of these deaths were, but it's provoked a lot of discussion anyway around, certainly in this country. And I think there's been concerns elsewhere also about young athletes or young retired athletes who are far too young having heart issues well before COVID and the vaccine. But it seems that maybe there's been more of them in the last year or two than otherwise. But it's a very difficult thing to ascertain.
Let me ask you, because you alluded to this a little bit, and you're correct. And I was seeing literature on marathon runners dying of heart disease, 3, 4, 5 years ago that was being discussed. And one of the concerns, like you mentioned, is they're constantly swilling these high glycemic index simple sugars, these gels and stuff, and they're consuming massive quantities of Gatorade, and they're performing all the time. They're probably doing it 5 or 6 days a week, ingesting how many hundreds of grams of simple sugars weekly, and probably seeing some blood glucose excursions all during this time while it's occurring. Do you think that has any relevance in the development of cardiovascular disease, perhaps?
Well, I think it does. I think we've been shown. I mean, it seems now that there's good evidence that this sort of chronic low-grade inflammation is behind a lot of chronic disease, including atherosclerosis. We always thought it was the cholesterol, but I think now people realize that it's actually the inflammation in the arteries that attracts the cholesterol. So the inflammation is the thing that comes first. And we know that there are various factors that promote inflammation. I mean, we know smoking is one, for instance. But we also know that there are various dietary factors that are pro-inflammatory, if you like, and sugar is certainly one of those. I think vegetable oils are probably the omega-6 polyunsaturated fats are another. And so I guess there is certainly a potential mechanism for high blood sugar, glycation, attaching to proteins and causing damage to arterial walls. So it's probably not that surprising that very high intakes of sugar may be related to the onset of cardiovascular disease. I think that's very feasible.
One of the things, and it's easy to make the association, as we've seen the rise of these synthetic, vegetable oils, these seed oils, over the last course of several decades, it's gone up tremendously. Heart disease, well, heart disease actually, probably has been relatively stable. I mean, we've seen a dramatic drop in smoking, which probably accounts for much of the improvements. But certainly diabetes, obesity, autoimmune disease, all these other things have increased. And for me, it's like, well, I could say, well, there's a line with the seed oils going up and then all these diseases following it. But it's also hard to extricate that from just the fact that seed oils are in all of this processed garbage. I mean, it's almost synonymous. If you look on the store packages and you pull every item on the shelf and you're going to see safflower oil, sunflower oil, corn oil, canola oil, whatever, soybean oil. Can we actually pull those apart, or just say, I think the easiest thing for me, and this is the thing I wanted to mention, you said you're an advocate of a low carb diet. Really what we are advocating is a whole food diet, basically, because when you go low carb, you're pretty much advocating for whole foods, whether it's fruits, vegetables, meat, dairy, eggs, you're by default eliminating all that stuff. Now, of course, the food manufacturers are sneaky and they put a label on it. This is low carb and it's garbage. It's just a bunch of chemical glop that doesn't have sugar in it. How do we, like I said, it's hard for me to point my finger at one thing. I know Gary Taubes, he's wrote his book, and like you, I read Good Calories, Bad Calories, and was more than convinced that this is the absolute truth. It was just how much we don't know and how much potentially is wrong, and it made me question things. Like, no doubt it made you question things, and then you start doing your own research, your own N=1 experience, and all of a sudden, lo and behold, everything you thought was true is perhaps not true. So how do you, let me just talk about the diabetes, because that obviously that's growing. It's an epidemic. It goes hand in hand with the obesity epidemic. And I think we're going to see a dementia epidemic to follow in 10, 20 years with the same etiology. How hard is, one of the things, I'll just touch on COVID. One of the biggest disappointments I saw was, I thought this was a tremendous opportunity to educate people on the value of a healthy host, a healthy immune system, not being obese, not being diabetic, controlling those things. And in the United States, we've largely ignored it from every single health authority. I don't know if the Australians were the same way. Was there any effort to say, hey, now would be a good time to lose those extra 10 pounds. Now would be a good time to get yourself in a little bit of shape. Did that occur at all down there?
No, well, we tried, but the media just wasn't interested. Everyone was just so obsessed with COVID. They said, no, we can't talk about anything but COVID. And I absolutely agree. There's very clear evidence that, the people who get into trouble with COVID are the obese, the hypertensive, and the type 2 diabetes. They're the three groups that really don't do well with COVID. And perfect opportunity to focus on those issues, but completely lost in all the sort of, the drama of COVID. What I'm hoping is that as COVID the pandemic resolves, which it seems to be, that may be an opportunity to say, well, okay, let's look back and make sure that when the next pandemic comes, we're in much better shape to cope with it. So that's going to be my line for the next 12 months. But whether it gets any traction or not, I don't know. But it's such a clear link. You'd think this is the perfect chance for governments, for the medical profession to really mount a campaign to improve general metabolic health to enable us to cope better with these diseases. But no, same experience, unfortunately. Just this obsession with COVID and vaccines and things and lockdowns. And I live in the city that has the world record for the longest lockdown, Melbourne, Australia. That's not really we used to be called the world's most livable city. Now we're known as the world's most lockdown city. It's not a great thing to boast about, I'm afraid.
Yeah, that was 500. Is it still under lockdown? I don't know. I haven't.
No,
I
no,
haven't.
no, no. Well, the last few months have been pretty good, and we're almost back to normal now. But yeah, for a long time, and look, it did reduce. Yeah, we certainly didn't have the impact of deaths that they had in other countries and so on. But at what cost? So let's not go into that. We could be here for a few hours
Yeah,
otherwise.
yeah,
But
yeah. I agree. I think that the one thing that it did do for all the contention and divisiveness it's caused in this country, I'm sure others, a lot of people are starting to question the sort of the powers that be and saying, wait a minute, maybe they're sort of looking for alternatives. And I think this is where this plays into it's like, I'm saying, hey, look, we can get people off pills. Wouldn't that be a better solution? I think it's opened up a lot of people to be receptive to that. So I think there's some good that can come out of this. Tell me about a little bit more about the sugar by half. You kind of generally outline the reading too much sugar and the diabetes. How are you doing that? I mean, I know Paul as well. He's another sports medicine guy. I've met
yeah,
Paul,
yeah,
in
yeah,
person, and he's fun, great guy. How are you
yeah.
guys? How are you implementing that? How's it going? How much support are you guys getting for that stuff?
Yeah. Well, we felt there was a need for something like this, and we'd watched there's a very good program in the UK run by diabetes.co.uk that's had like 400,000 people go through their low carb program. There's obviously the Verta health program in the US, and so we looked at those and thought, we need to have something like that in this country, in Australia. And initially, we actually spoke to the UK people about licensing their product because it's pretty good. But for various reasons that didn't happen. So we decided to sort of bite the bullet and have a go ourselves, and spent probably 6 to 8 months, Paul and myself and one of our dietitians, Nicole Moore, in producing all the content. It's initially an app-based program, but we're currently also developing a web-based parallel program because I think that the older generation may be more comfortable with a web-based program than an app. They're probably not as app-friendly as some of the younger generation. So we'll have both of those up and running. And so yeah, I mean it's a good product. I mean all these. I mean it's got lots of great content and terrific recipes and like that. And we did a survey of our initial cohort. So we've produced the app. You subscribe to the app. It's very cheap. It costs a couple of dollars a week. And we did a survey of our initial cohort, the ones that took the app up in the first month. And after 3 months, we did a survey. And 62% of those people had put their type 2 diabetes into remission. And they'd lost an average of 7 kilograms in weight, reduced their medications, all the similar results to the UK and the Verta studies and so on. So it just reinforced the fact that clearly these programs work. They're very effective, and it seems that delivering it by an app is just as effective as other low carb programs. We're in fact just starting a full on independent research study into the efficacy of it all, because obviously that was just a survey of our members. We've got an independent university looking at a 12-month study of how effective it is, but we're confident that will show similar results. So these things certainly work. We've been going 12 months now. We've had about 5,000 people go through the program. That's we've got probably I don't know, a tenth of the population of the US. So I guess the equivalent is 50,000, but it's still pretty small numbers. We've got 2 million people in this country with type 2 diabetes, so it's a pretty small proportion of that. So the challenge, obviously, and it's been challenging in COVID times because as we said before, no health reporter or wants to talk about anything else but COVID. So the challenge now is how to get that message out there, how to market it, how to convince people to give it a go rather than just more and more medications, to convince doctors to recommend it, convince dietitians, because most doctors don't have time or the knowledge, but don't have time to give dietary advice. They see a patient for 10 minutes or whatever, and by the time they've taken their blood pressure and they've maybe done a blood test, that's about it. So we think this is a real sort of adjunct for medical practitioners to be able to give their patients a resource and say, go to this app, go to this program, and I'll monitor your progress, sort of thing. Similarly with dietitians, they can only see someone once a month or once every 2 months or whatever. This is something they can do in between. So we've had quite a bit of publicity in the media here. Every time we get publicity, we get a spike in subscriptions. But otherwise, it's tough. It's tough to get the message out there. It's become much more difficult, even in the last 12 months, to advertise and promote things on social media with Apple and Google restricting what you can say and so on. So it's very competitive out there. There are a lot of people out there trying to market on social media and so on. So it's a little frustrating. We'd love more numbers because we believe that it can be very effective. Word of mouth is our best. We have a Facebook group of all of our subscribers, which is very active. They share recipes and share experiences and so on. So that's great. But we'll get there in the end. But it's a tough gig.
Yeah, and I don't know. I've got an idea of what Australia has from a healthcare standpoint. In the United States, it's very much privatized. There's a lot of money to be made in healthcare. The model, particularly for the kind of disease management models, more what we have. We kind of have symptomatic, treatment of disease with different pills and procedures. It's a very cost and business sustainable model, but it's not very good for the end users. Australia, I mean, maybe that doesn't quite have the same financial incentives to keep people, consuming the healthcare dollars. Do you find that, there's an appetite for what you do? In the United States, we have an appetite within the people that are sick, but the payers and the people that profit off of disease are not so keen on, let's get people off medications. Is Australia similar, or do we have more of a financial alignment that would help?
Yeah, look, we've probably got we certainly spend far less of our GDP on health than North America, the US does. I think you're in a class of your own in that regard. But so it's probably an economically more efficient system. We have a hybrid system, sort of public and private health. And it generally works reasonably well. Most people can afford healthcare. There's a good sort of government-funded free health service in hospitals and general practice. But similar issues in that it's very hard to. I think a lot of it comes down to the sort of education of the doctors in a way. I mean, the problem is that doctors know nothing about nutrition or exercise as a form of therapy. I did medical school a long time ago, but I didn't have a single lecture on nutrition in my medical school, and I don't think things have improved that much in that time. So you naturally stay in your comfort zone. And as a doctor, let's say you're a family practitioner, your comfort zone is medications and surgery and procedures, and surgery, and so that's where you stay, and you don't venture out into beyond your comfort zone because you don't know that area, and so and also there's enormous support for the medical profession from the pharmaceutical industry. A lot of education is provided by the pharmaceutical industry, and they're obviously not interested in nutrition and so on. I mean, every government sort of comes in with this sort of line about promoting prevention and focusing on prevention because they realise that the cost of medicine is unsustainable in the long term. But they tend to focus on the wrong things, I think, a lot of the time. Part of the problem is that when they talk about diet and the government says, well, what dietary advice should we give the medical profession? They're still stuck in the old 1960s low fat sort of all we worry about is cholesterol and everything else will sort of sort itself out. And we know that that clearly doesn't work. We've just in the last 50 years we've just got fatter and sicker, and it really is bizarre. I mean, often there's that great graph of showing the obesity levels in the US over time, and it sort of is pretty flat until about 1980, and then it sort of takes off from 1980 onwards. And it's been steadily increasing ever since. And I often sort of think if someone was running a business and their bottom line was getting worse every single year for 40 years, wouldn't you at some stage in that 40 years think maybe we're doing something wrong, or maybe we could change something? But no, we just keep giving the same advice and people keep getting fatter and sicker. It's quite bizarre, really, that there's no questions being asked as what are we doing wrong, and clearly round about 1980 was when we changed to a low fat diet. The amount of seed oils increased rapidly, and it seems so obvious to people like you and I, Shawn. It's frustrating. It's hard to understand why it doesn't seem so obvious to everyone else. I mean, it's like the diabetes thing, and what is diabetes? Diabetes is a disease of carbohydrate intolerance. Okay, so you reduce the amount of carbohydrates. No. Our recommended diet is a low fat, because we're so concerned about this heart disease stuff. I mean, some things, when you take a step back, are so obvious, and yet the medical profession still won't accept that, won't acknowledge that. It's quite bizarre.
Yeah, one of the things is, become out, we've seen, I'm sure you've seen recent studies saying, when we're looking at cardiovascular risk factors, I mean, diabetes by far
Oh,
is a huge
huge.
risk factor relative to things like LDL cholesterol, which are, they're a blip on the radar compared to what we're seeing with diabetes or obesity or metabolic syndrome or prediabetes, any of those things. And yet we're so focused on the little minutia of I don't want to underemphasize it, but I think the import is vastly overstated relative to other things. Let me ask you, I think this is kind of the elephant in the room. You have something that works, or you see it work pretty reliably in diabetics. Reduce their carbohydrates, get them on whole foods, maybe do some exercise, and lo and behold, they come off their meds, or hemoglobin A1C normalizes, their life is better, they're happy, they're smiling. But how do you keep people engaged? How do you keep them to sustain? How do you keep them compliant? That's a criticism. Well, no one can do it for a long period of time. Or, and of course we're like, well, I've been doing it for 10 years. I've been doing it for 20. You see that all the time. How do you get more people in the compliant, long-term compliant category? Have you figured out the secret sauce for that yet? Is it still evolving, or what do you think?
Well, I think the secret is the results. I mean, when people see their results and feel so good, and everyone tells them, hey, you look great, you're feeling great, you got more energy, you sleep better, you concentrate better, all these sort of things. I mean, to me, that's the major motivating factor. That you've got yourself into this state of losing weight and being metabolically healthy. To me, that's pretty motivating to continue. And we all sort of drift off a little bit. But you soon put on weight, feel like crap, and realize, oh, hang on a minute, I've lost the plot here a little bit. I need to go back and it's a matter of finding the right amount of. We don't all have to be on 30 grams of carbs a day, for the rest of our lives. I mean, there's a right amount of carbs, if you like, for every person, and it's a matter of finding that. And some people may need to be, who are highly insulin resistant, but they can usually improve things as they go along. So, what I recommend is that people go hard for 3 months and really try and get their metabolic health under control, and then they can just play around a little bit and see what works and what doesn't work for them. And you know, but obviously there are people, particularly those with autoimmune. I mean, I know you're a great advocate of the carnivore diet, and I've had great success myself in recommending the carnivore diet to people who have significant, particularly those with significant autoimmune sort of issues and so on. I mean, so it's a matter of finding the right amount of the right diet for you. But that diet certainly doesn't include 300 grams of carbohydrates a day. That's for sure.
Yeah, well, sometimes I sort of dream about, I have a big camp where I can just kind of almost lock people in and say, all right, I'm going to feed you, I'm going to educate you, we're going to exercise, we're going to spend 3 months and just and fix the problems, and then you kind of release you off into the wild. That's not very scalable. Obviously, it's very expensive to do something like that. But I mean, sometimes that's what it takes for some people. I think you just have to kind of, because the world is not, it's not like we're going to wake up tomorrow and all of a sudden the food manufacturers are going to say, oh goodness, we got it wrong, we're only going to produce healthy whole foods. And they're going to continue to pad their bank accounts with as much processed cheap stuff as they can convince people to eat, and that's not going away. So getting people to navigate that landscape is challenging when it's like I liken it to being a heroin addict when heroin is extremely cheap, it's everywhere, and people encourage you to do it. I mean, you're going to fail in that environment. It's pretty hard to get out of that. So it's one of those things where you got to figure out how to extricate yourself from that, or be able to be immune to it, I suppose.
Yeah, it's difficult to have as you say, a wide impact, and that's where you need government support, you need support from the medical profession, And they're the two areas that we don't really have at the moment. And I think once we get, if we were to get those, two bodies on board, we could start tackling some of the issues like, advertising junk food to kids and this sort of stuff. I mean, we've got to tackle our children really. They've all become sugar addicted by the age of 10. I mean, it's just crazy. You get weaned off the breast onto fruit, fruit juice, fruit drinks, and full of sugar, and fruit yogurts that are full of sugar, and that we did with our kids because we thought that was healthy. But I mean, we've now realised we know that that's not right, and yet people are still pushing those lines, and so I think educating children. That's why we've done these lessons for schools and so on. I mean, it's just so important to educate kids, but there's so many other things that are influencing them. Advertising and very clever marketing. You look at breakfast cereals, how cleverly they market to them as to being healthy and full of fiber and reduced sugar and lots of colors and fancy packaging and little animals or little things that appeal to kids, and so kids demand that sort of stuff from the advertising and to their parents, and their parents in most cases will do everything to keep the kid happy and think that they're doing the right thing, because we've all been seduced by this propaganda really. And so there's lots of challenges that we've all, there's no one answer. Obviously, if there was, we would have done it. But it needs a combined, effort from government, from the medical profession, from the community to say, hey, enough. We've been getting fatter and sicker for 40 years. Let's stop this. Let's turn this around, because we know we can. We just got to have that will.
One of the things, and you made this point about, reduced sugar. And a lot of times what we'll see is, it'll be on the label that the sugar's been reduced. It's been reduced from 50 grams per serving to 42. It's still a ridiculous amount, but somebody reads it and, oh, it must be healthy because it's reduced sugar. It's still, a tremendous amount in there. So I think it's very deceptive. The labels are very deceptive. It's hard to navigate that as a consumer of sort of average interest in health, unless you're kind of a quote unquote health nut, you don't pay attention to that stuff and you just kind of read the labels. And it definitely is an uphill fight. Are you finding more and more physicians that are sort of getting it, that are kind of wake? I know I get messages from physicians all the time, and they're frustrated with they're like, I'm thinking about leaving medicine. I'm just so frustrated with what's around me. Do you feel that there's a shift going on that you can tell in the community where you're at?
Yeah, it's slow, but it's definitely happening. I notice it more in young doctors. I think they're much more aware of these issues than the older ones, who tend to be, unfortunately, still the leaders of the professions. So we've got a bit of a gap there really between. As I said, there are a lot of young doctors who are both practicing this way of eating, of diet and exercise themselves and understanding it. Whereas a lot of their more senior colleagues, and so they're very reluctant to speak up because their senior colleagues will not agree. And so whether you're a young hospital doctor or a young general practitioner, and your seniors, you don't want to upset the the apple cart. So you tend to live it yourself, but in your work environment, you're very reluctant because there've been cases in our country and in others where doctors have been suspended and had all sorts of restrictions put on them for advocating these sort of diets. So everyone's still a bit scared of that, and I think we've got to wait. We may have to wait until this sort of generation of senior physicians move on, and the younger ones sort of take over. But yeah, there are more and more doctors getting on board, and some dietitians and nurse practitioners and diabetes educators and so on, and just a lot more fitness personal trainers and athletic trainers and so on. So it's certainly slowly getting out there, but unfortunately, the people who make the big decisions to affect the dietary guidelines and things like this are still stuck in the old way, and it's going to take some time. You've just had your revision of your dietary guidelines, which in effect, despite Nina Teicholz's best efforts, have really not not made a huge difference, and despite overwhelming evidence. So it's very frustrating.
Yeah, I know she's trying to convince them to use actual evidence-based guidelines, which I think there's, like I said, I think they're politically based guidelines, and you may have to just play dirty pool to get it changed.
Yeah.
I don't know. Let me ask you: Australia is a country that is got a significant agricultural component. Obviously, beef, lamb in particular is big over there. As
Mm.
far as, let me ask you this: as a sports medicine specialist, sports scientist guy, do you find a role for things like beef and lamb in the athlete's diet to be effective? I know there's a lot of people that are pushing for these plant-based diets or minimizing that. Do you find any value in that? Are any of the Australian athletes utilizing it? The Australian rugby team, cricket team, who knows?
Yeah.
I'm sure you do.
Yeah, no, the majority are meat eaters. Certainly, there's a few high profile vegan athletes. We have a couple in our cricket team, but there's not that many of them. I think clearly, I mean, meat and fish are probably the most nutritious, and eggs probably, I think, are the most nutritious foods that we can have. And I think while it's certainly possible to compete at a high level without them, it's certainly a lot easier with that. I mean, the animal protein, we know animal protein is of higher quality than plant protein, so that's a really important component, and all the other nutrients that go on with it, and just value for size and money and so on. And people say, well, it's expensive. And I said, yeah, well, it might be a little bit more expensive, but you actually need less of it if you eat meat. I think it's very, very important for the athlete, and particularly the younger athlete, the growing athlete, the adolescent athlete. It's so important to have an adequate intake of meat. And we're very fortunate in this country that we've got great beef and lamb and then chicken as well. I mean, white meats are okay, but what I find particularly is for female athletes. I mean, if they're not eating red meat, they tend to really struggle. Whether it's the iron and other issues that I think it's really important for the female athlete to eat meat on a regular basis, because otherwise they're constantly iron depleted, and in many cases iron deficient, and that, as we know, is a big factor in performance. So there's obviously issues with weight and so on. Female athletes in particular are very conscious of their weight, and so in some cases see that the avoiding meat is a solution to that, and that turns out almost invariably to be a bad decision.
Yeah, I see, like I see, we're seeing it being heavily advertised and pushed, and we have some of these celebrities and celebrity athletes that are sort of, either sponsored by these companies, and they're out there, here I'm eating my one Impossible Burger a week or something, something that, probably it's something they eat just for the photo opportunity, and that's about it. But are you seeing? I mean, I see a lot of activism on the vegan side. Maybe it's, I don't know, maybe Australia's extra activist prone. I don't know, perhaps, or at least I see a lot of it. Are there serious efforts to remove meat from the standard person's diet there? Do you think it's going to have any success?
Um, I don't think we've gone as far as some other places, with meatless Mondays and school lunches and things like that. Because the agriculture industry is still quite influential in this country. But there's certainly more and more, and the vegans are very, very aggressive and very pushy in their marketing. But what I see is that a lot of vegan products are highly processed. I mean, they're actually not that healthy. I think one of the issues is that people often improve their health and their performance in some cases when they go onto a vegan diet. And I think what happens is they go off a standard American diet, if you like, or a standard Australian diet of high end processed food and high end carbohydrates, and go onto a vegan diet, and they're going to improve because anything's better than the standard diet. But I would argue that they would do even better if they were on on a more balanced omnivore, or eating plenty of meat as well. Because as I said, just the quality of the protein, the nutrition density of meat is so much higher than anything else. And these Impossible Burgers and so on, they've got 20, 30, 40 ingredients. I mean, meat has one ingredient. I always say to the people, if any food you see anywhere that's got more than 3 or 4 ingredients, keep away from it, because most of them are. And to be honest, it's not food. I mean, it's a chemical concoction. I mean, it might taste good and look like meat or something, but it's basically chemicals, and it's not food at all.
Yeah, I agree to that. And I think a lot of people are realizing that. And I think one of the other things we see is this push towards synthetic, lab-grown meat. And I think that's going to be economically not feasible. Looking at the science has come out that a lot of the evaluations seem to think this is not going to be scalable due to the enormous amount of reactors that are required. And it's not going to be likely. So we're going to continue to see this push for processed type food. Peter, let me ask you, it's been close to an hour. I want to be mindful of your time. What do you have what do you, for the next year or two, what's on the game plan? What are you looking to do? I mean, obviously you've got the diabetes awareness.
Yeah, we want to promote that as much as we can. As I said, I'm hoping that in the post-COVID world, we can really get our message over that we've got to what can we learn from COVID? Okay, you can talk about lockdowns and vaccines, all that sort of stuff. But, one of the biggest things we can learn from COVID is the importance of metabolic health and being metabolically healthy to cope with whatever the next insult is, whether it's another virus or whatever. And here's our chance to get ourselves right. And so I see that as maybe a window of opportunity to push in the sort of the media and government and so on. So I'll be focusing a fair bit on that, I think, over the next with some of my colleagues here in Australia, focusing on that. We're keen to get. I have a research position. I'm a professor at one of the universities here, and where, as well as our research study looking at the 12-month of people on the Defeat Diabetes program, we're doing some other research. We're doing an interesting research project that we've entitled The Effect of an Anti-Inflammatory Diet on Knee Osteoarthritis. We have quite an interest in knee osteoarthritis. We've done a lot of work of exercise in knee OA, but we're now looking at what we've termed an anti-inflammatory diet, which is basically pretty much a low-carb type diet, removing sugars and vegetable oils and so on. And there's been a small study done elsewhere, but this will be quite a large study and looking at that. And so it's sort of, I guess it's combining my two interests, my nutrition interests and my sports medicine interest. And we want to go on then and look at tendinopathy, because there's quite a bit of evidence, certainly evidence that diabetes and tendinopathy are closely linked. And we'd like to look at the effect of diet on tendinopathy. Certainly anecdotally, people seem to do much better when they remove all the pro-inflammatory foods and their Achilles tendonitis or tendinopathy, whatever you want to call it. So that's an area that I want to explore a bit more. There's some really exciting. There's some really exciting work. You mentioned dementia before. There's some really exciting work going on about the effect of diet on Alzheimer's disease, other chronic, things like Parkinson's disease, even mental illness. Which we now think might be an inflammatory component of that, and the effect of ketogenic type diets on mental illness. So I think it's a really exciting time, and unfortunately, it's very hard to do good nutrition research, as we know, both from a funding point of view, because most research in the world is funded either by pharmaceutical companies who are not going to fund nutrition research, or by governments, and we're going against the dietary guidelines, so they're not going to fund it. And so it's really hard to get funding for these nutritional things, but we need more of them, and there's some wonderful work by one of our New Zealand colleagues and neurologists on Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. It's showed very clearly that a ketogenic diet has a significant impact on Alzheimer's. And I remember talking to him, and I said, if that was a drug, you'd have been on the front page of every newspaper in the world, and probably you'd get a Nobel Prize. But no one's ever heard of it. because there's no one pushing it. There's no money in it, and so on. So that's the challenge I think we have is to to counter the impact of big pharma, big food, and get our message out there to governments, to doctors, to the public, and that's a constant, ongoing challenge. And I don't know about you, but I'm up for it, and we'll give it a crack.
Yeah, I'm up for it, and I tend to do it in a kind of a noisy and obnoxious way sometimes, but I think you need to, quite
Well, you're
honestly.
American, we expect that.
Yeah, yeah, that's my excuse. But this is an interesting thing. I was thinking about this, talking about the post-COVID era, and you and I have all heard, low vitamin D status, obesity, hyperglycemia, lack of exercise, all associated with negative outcomes. And I hadn't really heard much on cholesterol levels, but I just did a quick Google search, and there's a meta-analysis on cholesterol, and surprise, surprise, low cholesterol, total HDL, LDL cholesterol was associated with significant higher mortality rates. And so you're like, well, what do we want to focus on? Lower, of course, there's going to be the reverse causation people. Oh yeah, every time you get sick, your cholesterol goes down. But I mean, seriously, it's like cholesterol. High cholesterol didn't seem to make COVID worse, but certainly diabetes did. Certainly obesity did. Certainly, lack of exercise and lack of vitamin D did. So, maybe we can kind of use that to leverage and say, hey, maybe cholesterol we should kind of back off on and focus on these other metabolic indices. Peter, thank you. This has been a wonderful conversation, long overdue. I look forward one day to traveling to Australia and meeting you guys in person, or if you
Yeah,
come somewhere on this side of
love
the
to.
equator, I'd meet you there. But keep up the great work. Appreciate what you're doing, and thanks for saying it. And we have to be up to the fight. I mean, that's the thing. If we're not going to do it, no one is. So
Yeah,
good on
absolutely.
you. And I don't know if you've got I don't know. I'm, it's not World Cup time. I used to live in New Zealand, so I was kind of part and played rugby over there. So I was kind of a little bit
Yeah.
partial. My mother was South African, so I've been, had that back and forth in the rugby world. But it's
Right.
interesting.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Yeah, no, our rugby team's not too good at the moment, but anyway, we'll come good. But
you get
no,
back.
thanks, Shawn. I mean, it's a real pleasure to be on with you, and I love the work you do, and I've got your book here, and the way you promote everything. It's terrific. So it was a real honor to be involved here. So appreciate it.
Well, keep up the good work, Peter. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your morning. I guess it's morning time there. So happy
Yeah,
Saturday morning.
it's a beautiful sunny day. It's early autumn here in Melbourne, and yeah, looking forward to the day.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Take care, guys. See you tomorrow. Bye bye now.